My testimony is not particularly dramatic. I never really had what I would describe as a kind of road to Damascus moment. I basically grew up in a loving Christian family, and I've kind of steadily grown in my faith. Sometimes that's been at a slower pace, and sometimes that's been a quicker pace. But in general, it's been a kind of constant upwards trajectory, which I'm really grateful for. So as a child, my family spent quite a lot of time kind of hopping around different churches. So we lived in rural Sussex. And if you've kind of spent a long time in kind of rural England, you might recognize a similar kind of struggle, that it can be a bit of a spiritual wasteland. I remember going to the local church, and this might be being very unfair to them, but I remember attending certain services and having the kind of suspicion that whilst there might have been kind of 30 people in there, I had the suspicion that it might have just been me and the vicar that actually believed it. So my parents only had kind of one criteria for a church, and that it would be a church that wouldn't put my brother and me off of Christianity. So we kind of started working our way out from our house in kind of ever-increasing circles to try and find somewhere that fulfilled that brief. And in the end, we kind of wound up we basically ended up back in London. And we kind of gave up and started going to the church that my parents had been going to for a couple of years beforehand, which was HTB in South Kensington. So this was around the kind of time of the Toronto Blessing. So it was about 1994. For those of you that don't know, the Toronto Blessing was, it was what's it called? Basically a spiritual upwelling in the Vineyard Church next to the airport in Toronto. And it was it had a huge impact around the world. So it was a reformation, that's it. And it was kind of key in a lot of the kind of changing in the way that the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church viewed charismatic spirituality. So it had kind of massive effects around the world. And Holy Trinity Brompton was impacted massively by that. So I would argue all of the kind of the famous ministries that people have heard of basically came out of God's blessing in kind of 1994 with the Toronto Blessing. So I spent my childhood really very familiar with kind of the more visible, some would find them difficult kind of aspects of the fruits of the Spirit. So things like praying in tongues and spiritual healing were kind of completely normal in my mind growing up. I didn't understand that anybody would be unfamiliar with them. So I remember as a kind of example, kind of more personal example of that, I remember my dad for a while had really atrocious arthritis. His feet were so swollen that he didn't own a single pair. He owned one pair of shoes that fit him, but he had to take all of the laces out, and then he had to wedge his feet in them. And his hands were so swollen that when he got to work, he had to kind of hold his security pass between his hands to like scan himself into the building. So it was really, really bad. And I remember he kind of was praying one morning as he was getting ready. He said, one Sunday, he said, where should I go to church? Just kind of tossed it up there. And he felt really clearly in his head, Red Hill Baptist Church, come back, which was kind of oddly specific. So he went to the yellow pages, which was a thing at the time, looked through it, Red Hill Baptist Church existed. He phoned the number, and it was the secretary picked up and said, oh, well, you've missed the morning service, but funny you should ask, we're having our first evening service that we've ever had this evening. You can come to that if you want. So my dad drove there, went to that. It was perfectly nice, but, thoroughly kind of average. And he thought, well, what was the point in that as he was leaving? And he kind of felt God reply, I'm going to heal you. And at that moment, someone like a spotty youth tapped him on the back, said, excuse me, sir, is there anything you'd like prayer for? And my dad said, yeah, funny should ask. I've got crippling arthritis and God's just told me you're going to heal me. So the kid, to his credit, put his hand on his shoulder and prayed for him. And then my dad said thanks and left, and absolutely nothing happened. And it was 3 days. On the third, I think we'll say that was Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So on the Wednesday, he was shaving, and he realised that his hands didn't hurt, and he could use the razor properly. And he was absolutely, he was a bit weirded out by that. He went into his bedroom, and he suddenly found that every single pair of shoes that he had, laces included, fitted on his feet. And he's never had any issues with arthritis ever since. He was completely healed, which was thoroughly bizarre, but in a really kind of gentle way. So my Christian life wasn't entirely without kind of hiccups and kind of rough bits. My godfather, he was a tremendously intelligent man. He became a Christian at university. He was at Oxford, studied maths and did a 3-year maths degree at Oxford in 1 year. And then for the remaining 2 years he was there, he did a 3-year theoretical chemistry degree, then became a Christian, then went to Cambridge, got a degree in theology and became a minister. And he was kind of hugely driven, and his church grew massively. So I think their church had the largest youth group in their diocese, but it was done in a way that didn't take the rest of the church with them. And not everybody liked the growth at all. And the PCC and the wardens kind of performed a coup, basically, and they had him kicked out of the church. He later kind of observed that his issue was that he did God's will, but in his timing. And that was where the issue was. And in the end, he actually committed suicide. And to this date, he's the only person I've ever seen people attend his funeral just to make sure that he was dead. So both of my parents really threw themselves into church life when I was growing up. My dad preached at church. He led Alpha weekends. My mum ran Alpha groups. And for a period of almost a decade, we went to about 6 Alpha weekends a year. So if you're familiar with the Alpha course, they have like a weekend away, the Holy Spirit weekend. And I would do about 6 of those on average a year for about a decade. And it was such a normal thing for me that I even observed, I even asked my parents, or told my parents when I was really little, isn't it funny that Nicky Gumbel is always at the same holiday as us? So it was a really kind of familiar environment for me. I was very happy in that kind of environment. And I generally had a really happy childhood. The only area that I really struggled with was school. So I'm dyslexic, and I struggled quite a lot with kind of spelling, maths and stuff like that. And I was occasionally bullied, but basically I would kind of hold my head down, and like someone in kind of Stalin's Soviet Union, I'd just try to avoid everybody and try to avoid any attention, and that would avoid any bullying. And that was something that I basically only grew out of around the age of 18. There was probably one defining turning point in my childhood, though. So it was an event called Soul in the City. And there's a church in Watford called St Saviour. They have a massive kind of youth program. That's their kind of big focus. And in 2004, St Saviour organised a huge social project across the whole of London. So it was a period of a week, and it was 20,000 young people from all over the world. So just kind of get your head around that. 20,000 people between the ages of about 13 and 18, all coming to London and doing kind of social outreach. It was kind of painting people's houses, doing people's gardens. It was all really, really practical. And it was practical mission, serving the community. And there was something about it that really kind of engrossed me, because a problem that I have to this day is I really love God, but I really hate telling people about him, because I really don't like being preached to and prophetized to. And I know it would put me off if someone was to come up to me and say, Jesus loves you. My immediate reaction is, even as a Christian, even if someone comes up to me and tells me Jesus loves me in the street, my immediate reaction is, oh. So the concept of being able to evangelize without actually having to do anything cringy, I found just utterly mind-blowing. And that made a huge difference to my kind of faith. It was that I could have a faith that practically did things for people and that would have a positive impact on people. And that was a way that I could mission to people, was a huge kind of impact. And at the end of the week, they announced a similar event that they were organising in South Africa, but it was in 4 years' time. And something inside me really clicked, and I would recognise it as the nudge of the Holy Spirit. But basically, I just knew that I had to go to South Africa. I didn't know why, but there was kind of something in me that really stirred. Now, as a teenager, I don't know if all of you had a similar kind of experience, but I had lots of passing interests as I was growing. Like sometimes I'd be interested in one thing, but then, I might change in direction into something else. But my kind of passion for South Africa, and that really stayed with me through thick and thin. So that's probably, if someone was to ask me at the time, why are you so certain about it? My answer was always, I've been passionate about it ever since I heard it for 4 years. And absolutely nothing has dented that. So during this time, my parents attended an Alpha dinner in Bath and completely randomly sat next to a completely random couple who told them that their son had just got back from an orphanage in South Africa that their school organised outreach trips to. They put me in contact with the school, who basically said, don't get your hopes up, we're massively oversubscribed for it, and no one ever drops out. And then a couple of weeks beforehand, I kind of received a phone call from them saying, someone's dropped out, no one else wants to take the place, do you want to come as well? So I had a kind of panicky fundraising period and managed to get all the money and jetted off to South Africa. So that was in KwaZulu-Natal near Durban. At this stage, I was immature in my faith. Whilst I had a long faith, I wasn't necessarily arrogant enough to say that other denominations weren't Christians. So I wouldn't have said, I've got friends who would have said, oh, all Catholics are going to hell because they're not proper Christians. But I was definitely arrogant enough to be 100% certain that after 2,000 years, charismatic Anglicans had finally got it right, where like everybody else had got it wrong. But whilst I was out there, I was exposed to Christianity in a real kind of kaleidoscope of variety. So I would worship with Zulu Pentecostals, African Anglicans, independent churches, Korean Methodists, Swiss evangelicals, Baptists, Catholics. It was just an absurd kind of spectrum of people all worshipping the same God and kind of focusing on the same social issue. But they were all worshipping God in a kind of myriad of different ways. I remember we would have prayer meetings and there would be English, German, Korean, Zulu, and all spoken, all at the same time, all at the same prayer meeting. And it was really beautiful. It was a really beautiful thing. And it really impacted my faith. It kind of made me realize, oh, actually, I've been quite arrogant here. It's not as simple as just one group of people are right, one group of people are wrong. And it really helped give me a more mature view of the body of Christ, I suppose. So towards the end of my stay in South Africa, I knew I was going to have to come home, but my passion had kind of evolved slightly to, I knew I wanted to help people in those kind of vulnerable situations, but in a practical way. And so I didn't really know how to do that. So my logic was, well, I'll look into working for NGOs, kind of charities. And so I picked an appropriate degree and I moved back to England, and I moved to Portsmouth University to study geological hazards. I ultimately stayed on there to do a master's. Now, I would say probably my first priority when I was there was actually to find a good church, which is probably not the first thing that most kind of young Christians going off to university do, but it was the first on my to-do list was find a good church. I knew what I wanted. I wanted a kind of slick service with professional worship. I wanted it to be charismatic. It's important to kind of understand that my main experience of church at that point had been as part of a large congregation. And I was basically used to being a face in a crowd. And I liked the kind of anonymity that brought with it. But one of the things that I've grown to see in God, though, is a keen sense of humour. So instead of a very professional, slick, charismatic church, what I actually found myself in was an incredibly chaotic, messy New Frontiers church, about 120 people. On my first week, they managed to extract my university address from me and sent me a postcard welcoming me to the city, which was simultaneously really lovely and one of the creepiest things. But the second week, I went back. I don't know why, but I went back. And on my second week, I was approached by a short, stocky woman in her 50s who would foster children. So she was kind of really loving, really tough, and she kind of waddled up to me and kind of grabbed me by the hand, walked me over to the coffee station, and went, "You've been coming for a week. You should really be working on a team. Here, join the coffee team. They need people." And so they press ganged me into that because they'd seen me there once before. It wasn't what I'd have chosen on my own, but it was exactly what I needed. So it was a very much a loving family church. It wasn't a kind of corporate gathering. It was really messy. It was really amateur. But like it says in the Bible, we're made perfect in our weakness. And that was really very much the case for them. So because of its size, participation was not an option. So I was on setup team, the worship team, the welcome team, the coffee team, the prayer team, the students ministry team, and the PA team at various kind of points. It was a little bit like St Saviour's in that you just get stuck in. And what I found was because of that, I grew massively in my faith, and I grew in my maturity and ability as well. I think that's the other thing that is often left out on those kind of things. Often people will focus on, you'll grow in your faith. But things like the PA team and the coffee team, there are skills, and you learn a skill, which is actually really positive, and that's really helped me later in life. And just as a kind of side note, I was never baptized as a child. My parents were both Christians, but they wanted to let me make the choice myself. And it was during my time here at Portsmouth that I actually got baptized. I've heard lots of people say that church is a family of people and not a building. But Solent Community Church was probably the first church that I've met that really, really lived that. A bit like St Saviour's, actually. I would put them both in the same kind of category. They're both churches that really live together as a family. So during my time at university, just to kind of segue here, my dad left his job and he began working for HTB. He was asked to develop a course to help addicts kick their addictions. So he started working on a thing called the recovery course, which is a kind of 12-step program. And it was whilst he was working there that I found out that there was a job vacancy running on the logistical side of their homeless shelter. So I still wanted to work in NGOs, and I thought it would be an interesting segue potentially. And so I applied for the job and got it. Working with the homeless was full of challenges, but it was really rewarding. So I highly recommend it if you've not got experience in it. And with limited resources, we basically focused on helping people find housing and employment. We led Bible studies with them, we fed and clothed them, and we generally tried to treat them with as much respect and dignity as possible. It was here that I met Ollie and also Chris. So Chris was the clergy representative at the shelter, and he really threw himself into it in a way that other members of staff simply didn't do. And it was really refreshing. And that was where our friendship kind of started. What people didn't really realise at the time, though, was I was kind of struggling in London. So I'd left my church in Portsmouth, which had been really, really supportive. And I was struggling to make friends at work. I was back attending HTB. And when I wasn't completely anonymous, I was simply known as Nigel's son. And I realised after about 6 months of working there that I didn't really have any friends in London at all. And also the people who attended HTB, whilst being very well-meaning and nice, didn't really get the struggles that came with working with the homeless. It felt a little bit like, when soldiers come back from Afghanistan and they have to communicate with civilians. It felt reminiscent of that, of like people just not really getting, like they thought they got, but they really didn't understand. So one Sunday, I remember attending a church service in the morning, and then because I had no friends, I went to 2 more in the afternoon, and I didn't really have a proper interaction with anyone. So there's a horror film from I think the 60s or 70s called The Stepford Wives, and it felt very much like that. It was lots of like very smiley people, but there was no depth of relationship. Everyone just smiled at you, said hi, and then that was it. And in the third service, about 15 minutes into it, something just snapped in me, and I did the kind of mental arithmetic, and I realised that if I was hit by a bus on the way home that Sunday, no one would even know that I was dead until I didn't turn up for work on Tuesday, and even then, they would only notice when my absence inconvenienced them. And at that point, I burst into tears in the middle of the worship and desperately tried to fight my way out of the service. So just as a side note, if you're ever in a charismatic service, that's really, really, really awkward, because everyone around you thinks you're having a really wonderful spiritual experience and not a mental breakdown. And so I managed to kind of fight my way out amongst people kind of patting me on the back, going, oh yeah, go on, have a nice pray. And as I burst out of the church, I remember I was really angry. I was really, really angry with God. And I remember kind of fuming at him and asking him why I was in London, because I could kind of tolerate being miserable if I was getting closer to an objective. But I felt like I was miserable, and I was also just drifting. And I believe, so my language is going to get fruity here, but it's kind of important for the to be honest in this. When they say, oh, struggle with the Lord, it's often kind of implied in a kind of genteel way, and I've never found it works like that. I literally just prayed, I haven't even got any fucking friends. And as soon as I said that in my head, my phone rang, and I went, oh, that's weird. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, because no one phones me, and it was Chris. He'd just finished his the service that he was working at. And he wondered if I was available for a drink before he went home. So I kind of snatched at the opportunity, and we headed to the pub. Now, my experience of God speaking to me has always been it's been a gentle nudging. So it's never really a vocal thing. It's always taken the form as kind of an interesting thought or concept or an idea kind of drifting into my mind. And to this day, that moment is probably the closest I've ever heard him speak. And I suspect it might be the closest I ever hear him speak. But it instantly showed me that I did have a family in London, and I've clung to that ever since. So when Jenny and Chris moved to St Saviour's, there was never a question in my mind that I was going to come along with them to support them. At this time, I was really struggling with HTB. I was beginning to struggle in more ways than just kind of not having friends. And this quite significant moment with God didn't actually change anything there. If anything, it got considerably worse. So there are too many little things to list here, but a few of the kind of headlines were as follows. My dad's course had been really blessed by God. It had started out as 5 people in a room in a community centre in World's End Estate with like 3 volunteers and my dad. And it had grown to being all across the UK in 6 different countries, on 3 different continents, and in prisons. He was expected to stay on top of absolutely everything, and he wasn't given any support at all. He managed to secure funding from someone. He found a donor who offered to pay for an additional worker for a year. And when he took that information to HTB, they said, that's brilliant news. Congratulations. Well done. Please go back and ask him for £2,000 more, because he needs to pay to rent desk space at HTB in their own office. He also had to self-fund work trips. So he would go to America to do the course out there in the prisons. He wasn't allowed to kind of take time off, so he had to take his own personal holiday and pay for the flights himself. And it was basically like a plate spinning trick, with more and more plates getting added to it, and less support. The homeless shelter that I was working for was quite underfunded, but simultaneously it was used for every fundraising opportunity. My manager was becoming increasingly frustrated with the red tape that it took to do anything. So we'd sometimes use our own money for supplies, knowing that we wouldn't be able to get any of it back, where other departments kind of hemorrhaged money on things that we considered to be totally frivolous. So you'd have like a £600 HD TV for the worship department's office, that was fine. But if we spent £3 on a one-off item that came from an unapproved supplier, that would be declined. My colleagues were dropping like flies as well, so there was a huge amount of burnout. I started with 19 colleagues in my office. After 2 years, 13 of them had left, and of those 13, only 2 of them had jobs to go to. And with my dad, 3 years into my time there, all the stresses that were being piled on him kind of came to a head. And there was one kind of more seemingly insignificant thing that was added to the list, and in the middle of a meeting, he had a complete mental breakdown. Now, he used to work for a newspaper, so like having a complete mental breakdown is not a normal thing. Like if you can cope with that kind of stress, there's not many jobs that are more stressful than that. He went off from work sick, and during 10 weeks, he wasn't contacted by anyone on staff. And eventually he was called in for a prayer meeting. But the prayer meeting, what actually happened was he was sat down and made redundant illegally. So I was left in a position where I didn't want to betray the homeless who I was caring for, but I just witnessed my dad being driven to a breakdown and then just being completely discarded. So it's important to remember as well, at this point, I'd been a member of HTB for 25 years. They were the church that I'd viewed as my family. That was the church that I'd grown up with. That's the church I'd made friends with. And it was absolutely, to say it was shocking would be a huge understatement. After they kind of dispatched my dad, someone obviously realized that his son was on payroll. So to keep me sweet, they asked me to do a staff thought for the day, but scheduled it for a day that there'd be no one there to hear it, which, to be fair, was very sensible because I was angry. But it's that the act of doing that still wounded me really deeply. And there was never an attempt at any pastoral care for that. Once Chris left, he was replaced by an ordinand that we later discovered was asked to document everything that the shelter did that was against HTB's brand. And after a further year, my manager was also asked to attend a prayer meeting where he was asked to resign because they wanted to take it in another direction. It turned out that they'd illegally interviewed for the job without advertising it. And ultimately, I resigned in solidarity with him because I was just done. And then ultimately we discovered that the job was given to the wife of one of the clergy who'd been interested in doing it for a little while. So my years of struggling there had really dried me out spiritually. And this betrayal was the kind of discarded cigarette butt that kind of caused everything to ignite into flames, basically. And there was a rage. I think there's not really any words in English that are stronger than rage. But there was a real rage that kind of burnt inside of me, and I really, really struggled with it. And sometimes, even now, when I think I've kind of extinguished it and put it all out, it's like a forest fire. When you think you've put it all out, and you're like, great, it's good, and then suddenly it just springs up somewhere else, and you go, oh no, that wasn't fully put out. So I think of myself as a positive person, but honestly, I would say that I was consumed by a pretty rampant vitriolic hatred for HTB. And sometimes I struggle with that still. But on the plus side, doing all of this stuff, none of it came up. So that's a positive. And there's a quote by a guy called Jim Butcher, which is, "Light shines the brightest in the deepest dark." And it really speaks to me because all of the times that I've heard God really is when I'm in a dark place. During this time, I can honestly say that I'm so grateful that God put me in St Saviour's, because without the love and support, known and unknown, of both the 9:30 and the 11 service, there's a very real chance that I would have lost my faith. So my dad didn't have that support, and to my knowledge, he no longer has any relationship with God at all. In times like this, one of my favorite passages is Romans 8:28, which is, "All things work for the good of those that love God." And the way that I interpret this is not that everything will be good for Christians, but rather that God doesn't waste our suffering. So if I hadn't felt isolated, I wouldn't have realized how good a friend Chris was. if I hadn't worked for HTB, I would have never moved to St Saviour's, and I'd have still experienced that same betrayal, but I wouldn't have had the support network that I do here. Working for the homeless shelter helped me in loads of ways, but it also allowed me to see that the people who managed to escape the kind of trap of homelessness were always people who managed to find someone who was willing to give them a chance, and that was either with a job or accommodation. And that realization kind of kindled a new passion in me. So I no longer want to work in charity work, but I want to work in social transformation, employability schemes, getting homeless people and ex-offenders into employment so they can then find work elsewhere. Yeah. So God also took me out of an incredibly toxic work environment and placed me in a caring, supportive one at my current job, with Coffee Geek and Friends. And my bosses who aren't Christian have been the most loving, supportive bosses I've ever had in my life. And in conclusion, I suppose, I'd like to just remind you that God uses you even when you don't know it. So correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I doubt you heard an audible voice on that day telling you to invite me to the pub. I suspect you just wanted a drink and you didn't want to go on your own. But I honestly can't think of a more important phone call that I've ever received. And congregation members at St Saviour's weren't aware of all this stuff going on, so you guys weren't giving me special treatment when you were being nice. You were just behaving with kindness, and that made a real difference as well. My favorite book of the Bible is Revelation. And in Revelation 2, God gives messages to the global church in kind of 7 different forms. The churches are basically broken down into a church that tests and confronts false teaching. It's kind of an academic church. The persecuted church, a kind of laissez-faire church, a church with bad teaching, a lively church, a kind of poor, seemingly insignificant church that just gets on with it, and a wealthy, apathetic church. And in this list, there are only 2 churches that God doesn't rebuke and doesn't have any criticism of. And that's the persecuted church, and it's also the small, faithful church. And so if I was to summarize my journey of faith, it's been God leading me from the kind of lively, wealthy church into the small, faithful church. And that's a transition that I'm so immeasurably grateful has taken place. So I think that's basically where I am now.